Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me. Today, let's spend some time with Dear Edward by Ann Napolitano. This book was published originally back in 2020, and I decided to read it because back early in 2020, or at the very end of 2019, I read this article of the most anticipated books of 2020, and this book was listed among those. It's really kind of weird because I'm still reading off that list from that time, those books from 2020 released. I read the article from that same publication. I read the most anticipated books of 2021 and the most anticipated books of 2022, and I didn't add anywhere close to the number that I added from that list from 2020. So I guess 2020 was just a good publication year for me. But anyway, Dear Edward by Ann Napolitano. So what this is about, it's mainly about this young boy named Edward, or as the book opens, his name is he's being called Eddie. He's 12 years old, and his family is moving from New York to LA because his mother is a writer. She writes for a television series, and his father is a mathematician, but in order to sort of advance her opportunities, her writing opportunities, she has decided to relocate out to California, so they are boarding a plane. So as the book opens, they're boarding this plane. They're in the gate area, of the airport, and we see a few other of the, going to be the passengers on the plane. They end up boarding the plane. They end up taking off, whatever. And then in chapter 2, we discover the plane has actually crashed. So in Eddie is the only survivor. And so this is basically what the book then is about, is these two alternating time frames. So in I think it's the odd chapters, we are on the plane, as it's making its way to what we already know right at the beginning of the book, that it's going to crash and that Eddie is going to be the sole survivor. So we have that storyline going on in I think it's the odd chapters, and then in the even chapters, we have Edward, and then in his life after the crash, because after the crash, he was known, his formal name was Edward, and so it was in the news that he was the survivor, and they just people start calling him Edward because that's the name that his official name. I guess that was on his ticket. And so we sort of have these two different personas in a way. We have Eddie on the plane, and we have Edward then, in his life afterwards. So after the plane crashes, I mentioned he's the only survivor. So that means all his family was killed. His mom, his dad, and his older brother were all killed. So he goes to live with his aunt and his uncle in New Jersey. So he had been living in New York City, and now he's living with his aunt and his uncle. And, he's very sort of traumatized. He's very quiet. Now, I want to disclose, I'm not going to disclose anything in this chat that I think would detract from a first-time reader's experience with the book, but I do want to let you know that this book, reading this book, I went through this book mostly thinking I really wasn't connecting with the characters, but eventually there was quite an emotional punch, and I even actually cried a little bit here in this book, and that's not an easy thing to do for me in a book, to cause me to tear up, but this book did it, even though I went through most of the book thinking that I wasn't really connecting that well with the characters. And the reason for this is, I think, because the character Edward, the young boy after the crash, is very traumatized, so he's very withdrawn. His aunt and uncle really try in their different ways, and I'm going to talk about that more here in a bit, to help him. But, how do you help someone in this situation? It's really hard to know what to do correct. Plus, they have their own issues. They have their own baggage. They have their own lives. And so they're not perfect people, and neither is anyone around him. Now, he does connect with a neighbor family. There is a single mom who has a daughter around his age, who he meets kind of early on, and he really sort of bonds with the daughter. And I think that's because that's a place he can go, and with this neighbor girl Shay, he can kind of be himself. She doesn't really care if he just is quiet or whatnot. She thinks he's special. She starts off thinking he's special because he survived this experience, right? Sort of like Harry Potter survived an experience where he should have actually been killed, but he wasn't. So she thinks he must have some kind of magic, and the book kind of explores this too. If whether or not he's really a special person because he survived, or just it's just, but that's what happened. So I thought the one way to approach this chat would be to talk about the three different parts of the book. The book is divided into three different parts, and each part starts off with a quote that sort of sets the tone then for that part. And so here's the first one for part one. The quote is, "Since death is certain, but the time of death is uncertain, what is the most important thing?" That's by Pema Chandran. Since death is certain, but the time of death is uncertain, what is the most important thing? So yeah, right off the bat, we know there's going to be a lot of death because we know this plane's going to crash, and everybody on the plane is actually going to be killed. So actually, the cover here, these birds, this has a meaning in the book. There's 191 people. There's 192 people total on board, including the crew, and there's 191 birds in this memorial that gets created for the crash, because that's all the passengers except for Edward. So there's I think that quote is just really, really beautiful. At the time of death, so we get a real sense of, we know the plane's going to crash. So the chapters that deal with the passengers on the plane, we get to know quite a lot of the passengers. There's a passenger who's like leaving her husband. He doesn't know she's left him yet. She's a free-spirited person. She's starting a new life out in California. There's a really rich, old, sick man who's sort of nearing death from illness, who has spent his whole life making money. There's another kind of younger version of that man, who is some sort of finance person, young guy though, who has living this sort of fast life, making a lot of money, but living this sort of shallow life. We get to know one of the flight attendants pretty well. There's a young woman who is pregnant. She's gotten pregnant by this guy, and she's going out to California to meet him. She's not real sure about that relationship. There's an Army veteran returning home that's kind of a closeted gay guy that's been in Afghanistan, I believe. So there's a lot of other lives on this plane that we all know. We know they're going to end. They don't know it though. So that's kind of the key thing there. And I've got a quote coming up about that here in a bit that I think is really cool. But let's talk about part two then. Part two, the quote for part two is, "What do we live for if it is not to make life less difficult to each other?" That quote is by George Eliot. What do we live for if it is not to make life less difficult to each other? So, helping each other. There's a lot of people that really try to help Edward in the best way they know how. And it's not always what he wants or needs, but they're trying, right? And he ultimately recognizes that. And I think that was what really pulled the emotional punch for me there towards the end, that caused me to tear up, was the fact that he recognized that these people tried their best, or were trying their best for him. And it wasn't always connecting with him, but nevertheless, they were trying. And I think that was really, really beautiful part of the book. And then the third part here, part three's quote is, "We contain the other hopelessly and forever," by James Baldwin. So Edward can't escape the fact that he was on that plane. There's something that happens eventually in the book. He discovers something. I'll just put it that way. He discovers something very important. His uncle has been trying to protect him. His uncle tried to find out all he could about the crash. He went to all the transportation board hearings and things like that. The aunt really tries to nurture him, but she can't really, because she's got some issues. She had a miscarriage not that far previously in the past that she's still scarred by. And so, she's trying, though, to nurture him. But Edward eventually comes across some information, comes across some things that ultimately helps him to heal, that he discovers. He and Shay, the neighbor girl. So I won't go into that any more than that. But, the lives of all these people are tied together. The lives of the family itself, the nuclear family, the aunt, uncle, the parents that have died, the brother, tied very intimately there, the neighbors, the wider community, the school, the principal at the school is kind of a main character here. His doctor that he sees a psychiatrist, and then the relatives and friends and family and loved ones of the victims from the plane that we get to know a little bit about as well as we discover this. So everybody is connected really in this way, and I thought that was just such a beautiful way that this unfolded, because I really didn't see this connection coming for me until later in the book. And as I mentioned, it did pack quite an emotional wallop. So there's a couple of quotes here that I just want to touch on before I run out of time. One is from the character that's running. She's on the plane. She's left her she's this free-spirited person. She's left her husband. He doesn't know it yet. It's not that she doesn't love her husband, though. It's just that she needs she wants to start something different. She's actually sitting by the young woman who has become pregnant and is unsure about the relationship that she's going to meet up with this guy out in California, the father of her baby. So they're sitting by each other. So they have several conversations, and this is one of them. So the free-spirited older lady is named Florida. So she says, Florida smiles at the girl. Everything ends, she says. That's nothing to be sad about. What matters is what starts in that moment. This moment, says the girl next to her. That's right, says Florida. So, even though we know, the reader knows, their lives are actually about to end within the next couple of hours. They don't know that. So the important thing is, I think here, the thing I took away from this particular quote is, live your life, to pick it up right up till the very end. Because you never know when that's going to happen for you. And so, live it right up till the very end. Then there's another quote here that is about the connection then that we eventually see, the reader comes to understand that between the characters. And this is between Shay and Edward. And the quote says, Shay is this Shay because of him, and he is alive, not just surviving, but alive because of her. He wonders if the scientists who tend to the Large Hadron Collider are hoping to discover not only what happens in the air between two people, but how that pressurized air changes those people inside their skin. He hears the science teacher say, the air between us is not empty space. I think that's so beautiful. The air between us is not empty space. We are all connected, past, present, and future. Edward is constantly, and continues to be and will forever be linked to the people on the plane. He actually reminisces at one point that he shares that he thinks of them all still just on that plane on their way, forever on their way to Los Angeles. And as long as he's really alive and, here in the world, then they will be on that plane on their way forever to Los Angeles. I think that's just such a really beautiful connection. There's so many of these little moments that people have, their thoughts that they have. The mother has a thought on the plane at one time, like, maybe I shouldn't have taken this job. We could have just lived simpler. Maybe I should have just lived. We could have moved out of the city, lived simpler. We could have moved somewhere closer to her sister, the aunt where, Edward goes to live, and had a different life, and she could write the book she wanted to write rather than what she was sort of forced to do for her job. Of course, that wasn't meant to be for her, but that's just sort of the beauty of this book, like these little moments that we see among the characters on the plane, and then also among the community there after the crash, trying to support Edward. All right, I will leave the chat with that. My next chat is going to be Dona, Flor, and Her Two Husbands by Jorge Amado. I already finished this. I loved it. It was so fun. I'll have a chat on this coming up fairly soon. Until next time, take care.